Mama, we have a feeding routine for her. I raised 4 children, Ifeoma. I know when a baby needs to eat. I did not know that you were here.
I came to help with the baby. Mama, we were going to call you.
My daughter-in-law's mother moved in to help with the baby and never left. 6 months. That is how long Ifeoma's in-laws stayed in her son's house after promising she was only coming for 2 weeks to help with the new baby. 6 months of watching a stranger rearrange her son's kitchen, correct her grandchild's feeding schedule, and slowly, quietly, make herself the true head of a household she had no right to run. But the woman everyone assumed was simply overstaying her welcome was hiding something far heavier than laziness or greed. Something none of them discovered until it was almost too late to fix what her silence had already broken. If you've ever had someone move into your peace and refuse to leave, stay with this one to the very end, because the reason will surprise you. And if stories like this speak to something in your own life, subscribe now, because we tell the truth here, even when it's complicated. This is not a story about a wicked mother-in-law, and it is not a story about an ungrateful daughter either. It is a story of how easily good intentions, left unspoken and unexamined for too long, can quietly reshape an entire household without anyone meaning any harm at all. And about what it finally takes for a family to stop tiptoeing around a truth everyone can feel, but no one wants to be the one to name. Ifeoma Okonkwo had built her home in Enugu over 31 years of marriage, first with her husband, now 4 years gone, and then, after his passing, with the quiet, steady discipline of a woman who had learned to run a household alone and run it well. She had buried her husband, Chief Okonkwo, after a short illness that had taken him faster than anyone expected. And in the 4 years since, she had rebuilt her life around her church women's group, her small tailoring business, and above all, her only son, Obina, whom she had raised after her husband's death with a fierce, protective love that sometimes, she privately admitted to herself, edged closer to possessiveness than she liked to acknowledge. Her own mother-in-law, decades earlier, had been a difficult woman, quick to criticize, slow to praise, the kind of elder who made a young bride feel permanently on trial in her own marriage. Ifeoma had promised herself, standing in that woman's kitchen as a frightened 23-year-old newlywed, that she would never make another woman feel that way in her own home. It was a promise she had largely kept over the years, earning a reputation in her extended family as an unusually warm and generous mother-in-law figure, the kind other women's daughters-in-law sometimes envied. Her only son, Obina, had married 2 years earlier, a warm, clever young woman named Ngozi, a pharmacist with a gentle laugh and an even gentler way of handling Ifeoma's occasional sharpness, the kind of daughter-in-law Ifeoma had prayed for without quite admitting to herself how specific her prayers had been. When Ngozi gave birth to a little girl, a little Adaora, Ifeoma had wept with joy in the hospital corridor, certain that this new chapter of their family would be the sweetest one yet. She had not accounted for Chinwe. Chinwe was Ngozi's mother, a soft-spoken woman from Owerri who Ifeoma had met only twice before the birth, once at the traditional wedding, briefly amid the noise of 200 guests, and once at the church wedding 6 months later, where they had exchanged little more than polite greetings and admiration for each other's asoebi. She remembered her as pleasant enough, unremarkable, the kind of co-in-law you nod too warmly at family functions and otherwise think little about between events. When Adaora was born, it was agreed, in the easy way such things are agreed among Nigerian families, that Chinwe would come and help for 2 weeks, the traditional period of Omugwo, when a new mother's own mother comes to nurse her through the earliest, hardest weeks of caring for a newborn, cooking the pepper soup, washing the baby's clothes, letting the young couple sleep in shifts while she absorbs the exhaustion herself. Ifeoma herself extended the invitation by another week, telling Chinwe warmly, "Stay as long as Ngozi needs, my sister. What is family for?" But the third week became a fourth, and the fourth became a month. And somewhere in that stretch of time, Ifeoma began to notice things that unsettled the easy hospitality she had offered without a second thought. If you've ever opened your home to someone out of kindness and slowly felt the ground shift beneath your own feet, you already know exactly where this story is headed. We're only just getting started, and the real reason behind Chinwe's silence is far more complicated than anyone in that house suspected. Let's continue. It began with small things, the kind of small things that taken alone mean nothing, but stacked one on top of another begin to form a shape you can no longer ignore. Chinwe started rearranging the kitchen in Ifeoma's house, moving the pots to shelves that suited her own habits rather than the ones Ifeoma had used for 3 decades. She reorganized the spice rack. She began cooking meals without asking what anyone preferred, simply announcing at mealtimes what had been prepared, as though she, and not Ifeoma, were the woman of the house.
Ifeoma said nothing at first. She told herself it was a small adjustment, the natural friction of 2 women from different kitchens sharing one space temporarily, and that patience would smooth it over. But then came the matter of the baby's feeding schedule. Nguzi, sleep-deprived and still finding her footing as a new mother, had been following the pediatrician's guidance on Adaora's feeding times, a schedule she and Ifeoma had discussed together in the baby's first 2 weeks, adjusting it gently as Ifeoma offered her own decades of experience. But once Chinwe settled in fully, she began quietly overriding that schedule, feeding Adaora on her own timing, insisting the baby looked hungry regardless of what the clock or the pediatrician's chart said, until one afternoon, Ifeoma found herself standing in the nursery doorway watching Chinwe rock a crying Adaora, having fed her only 40 minutes after her last feeding, undoing an entire structure Ifeoma and Ngozi had built together with real effort. "My sister," Ifeoma said carefully, keeping her voice light. "We usually feed her every 3 hours. The doctor advised it for her digestion." Chinwe did not look up from the baby. "A hungry child does not read the doctor's clock, ma. I have raised 3 children of my own. I know when a baby is hungry." It was said pleasantly enough, with a small smile even, but underneath the pleasantness, Ifeoma heard something else entirely, a quiet, unmistakable assertion of authority, the sound of a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that this was now her house to run. There were other small collisions in those weeks, each one easy to dismiss on its own. Chinwe Didan answering the door for visitors before Ifeoma's own house help could reach it, greeting guests with a familiarity that suggested years of residence rather than weeks. She took to instructing Ifeoma's gardener on which vegetables to plant for the coming season, information he then relayed to Ifeoma with visible confusion about which woman he was meant to be taking direction from. On Sunday lunch, 3 weeks into her stay, Chinwe reorganized the seating at the table without asking, placing herself at the head where Ifeoma had sat for 31 years, a shift so subtle that no one else at the table seemed to notice, but Ifeoma noticed, and something in her chest tightened at the quiet, wordless message contained in that single moved chair. Even Ifeoma's own sister, Ijeoma, no relation to the child, simply a woman with a long memory for family gossip, remarked on it during a phone call. "I hear your co-in-law has settled in rather comfortably," Ijeoma said, with the particular delicacy family members use when they are fishing for gossip while pretending not to. "Comfortable is one word for it," Ifeoma replied carefully, unwilling to give the family rumor mill more fuel than it already had. Ifeoma raised the matter with her son that evening, catching him alone in the compound as he came home from work. "Obina, has anyone spoken to your mother-in-law about how long she intends to stay? It has been over a month now." Obina rubbed the back of his neck, the same gesture he'd made as a boy whenever he was caught between 2 people he loved and didn't want to disappoint either one. "Mama, Ngozi says her mother wants to make sure the baby is settled before she goes. She's been such a big help, honestly. Ngozi is sleeping better. The house runs smoothly." "The house runs smoothly because your wife's mother has decided how it should run, my son, and that is a different thing entirely from help. There is a difference between a visitor who assists and a visitor who takes over. I am not saying your mother-in-law is a bad woman. I am saying 2 weeks has become 5, with no end mentioned, and no one in this house has had the courage to ask her directly when she plans to return home. Obina sighed. The particular sigh of a man who understood his mother probably was right, and didn't want to be the one to act on that understanding. I'll talk to Ngozi about it, he said, and Ifeoma let it rest there, though something in her chest remained unsettled, the way a pot left simmering too long begins to smell faintly of scorching before anyone notices the flame is too high. Nothing changed. 2 more weeks passed. Chingwe remained. If anything, the household settled deeper into the new shape Chingwe had given it. She began accompanying Ngozi to Adaora's pediatrician appointments, answering the doctor's questions before Ngozi could speak, until the pediatrician, a brisk young woman new to the practice, began addressing her questions directly to Chingwe out of simple habit, further eroding whatever authority Ngozi had left in the one domain, her own daughter's medical care, she had assumed would remain unquestionably hers. Ngozi mentioned this to Ifeoma almost in passing during a Tuesday visit, and Ifeoma filed it away with the growing collection of small, unsettling details she had begun keeping, almost without meaning to, the way a woman keeps track of a slow leak in her roof, unsure whether it warrants alarm or simply patient watching. There was also, Ifeoma noticed, a change in Obina. Her son, ordinarily easygoing and quick to laugh, had grown quieter in the evenings, his shoulders carrying a tension she recognized from his childhood, the particular posture of a boy caught between 2 women he didn't want to disappoint. When she asked him directly how he was managing, he gave her the kind of careful, diplomatic answer that told her more than a genuine complaint would. That single sentence, "I just wish I understood why," settled into Ifeoma's mind and stayed there, becoming the question she found herself circling in quiet moments over the following days. Matters came to a head briefly over the question of Adaora's naming ceremony. Ifeoma had assumed, as was customary, that she and Ngozi's parents together would agree on the date and the guest list, with input from both families balanced evenly. Instead, she learned from her own hairdresser of all people that invitations had already been gone out for a date Ifeoma never been consulted on, chosen it turned out entirely by Chingwe, who had taken it upon herself too.
Coordinated with the caterer and even select the asoebi fabric without a single conversation with Ifeoma about any of it. Ifeoma had confronted Ngozi gently about it, more confused than angry. "My daughter, did your mother not think to include me in these decisions? This is my granddaughter's naming ceremony as much as anyone's." Ngozi's face crumpled with an embarrassment that told Ifeoma all she needed to know about how little control her daughter-in-law had actually had over the decision herself. "Mama, I'm so sorry. I told her we needed to call you first, and she said she was only trying to save everyone the stress of back and forth planning, that she would handle the details and we could simply approve them. I didn't realize how far she'd already gone until the invitations were already printed." It had taken a tense, awkward phone call between Ifeoma and Chingwe to unwind the arrangement and rebuild it properly, with both families' input honored. And though Chingwe had apologized readily enough once confronted, insisting she had only meant to help, the incident left Ifeoma more convinced than ever that something beneath the surface was driving Chingwe's need to control every corner of the household she'd embedded herself into, something that went beyond simple enthusiasm for her new grandchild. If you've ever watched a situation everyone privately worries about, but no one wants to be the first to address directly, you'll already understand the tension building in this house. Nobody wanted to be rude to an elder. Nobody wanted to insult a new grandmother's devotion to her grandchild. And so the silence stretched and stretched. And inside that silence, something else entirely was quietly falling apart, though none of them yet knew it. We'll get to that soon. But first, the tension in that house was about to reach a point no one could politely ignore any longer. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon, nearly 2 months after Chinwe's arrival, when Ifeoma visited her son's small flat unannounced, wanting to see her grandchild without the formality of calling ahead first, as she had always done freely before Chinwe's extended stay had somehow shifted the rhythm of visits in that house too. She found Chinwe there as well, though the arrangement had originally been that Chinwe stayed at Ifeoma's compound and only visited the young couple's flat during the day. It turned out Chinwe had, over the past 3 weeks, quietly begun sleeping over at the flat several nights a week, occupying the small guest room that had been intended eventually for Adaora's own nursery as she grew older. Ifeoma found Ngozi in the kitchen, looking thinner than Ifeoma remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with new motherhood exhaustion and everything to do with something else entirely. The particular exhaustion of a woman caught between two people she loved and unable to please either one fully. "Ngozi, my dear, are you well?" Ifeoma asked her daughter-in-law's hands. Ngozi's eyes filled with tears almost instantly, the kind of tears that had been clearly been held back for weeks, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right tone. "Mama," she said quietly, glancing toward the hallway to be sure her mother wasn't within earshot. "I don't know how to say this to her. She's my mother. I owe her everything. But I don't recognize my own home anymore. She's decided how Adaora should be raised, how the house should be arranged, even what Obina and I should eat. I love her, Mama. I don't want to hurt her. But I don't know how to ask my own mother to leave my own house." "Has she given any indication of when she planned to go home?" Ifeoma asked gently. Ngozi shook her head slowly. "Every time I bring it up, she changes the subject, or she says, just a little longer, or she starts talking about how much she misses spending time with Adaora once she leaves, until I feel too guilty to push further. Mama, something feels wrong. She left home more than 7 weeks ago now, and she has barely called her father, not even once that I've noticed. When I asked her about it last week, she got strange with me, almost frightened looking, and changed the subject so fast I didn't have the heart to press her." Ifeoma sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the shape of something larger than mere overstaying begin to take form in her mind, though she could not yet name it. A woman does not avoid her own husband's calls for 7 weeks without a reason heavy enough to explain the silence. She thought, unbidden, of her own mother, who had endured 40 years of a difficult marriage without ever once considering leaving, not because the marriage was happy, but because in her generation, a woman's own home was considered the only respectable place to weather any storm, however violent that storm became behind closed doors. Ifeoma had promised herself, watching her mother's slow erosion over the decades, that she would raise her own life differently if she were ever given the chance. And here, perhaps, was an echo of that same old story playing out 1 generation later, a woman fleeing into silence rather than confronting what had been done to her directly. The thought made Ifeoma's chest ache with something closer to recognition than judgment. Whatever was keeping Chinwe in that house went deeper than devotion to a grandchild. Ifeoma recognized with the particular clarity of a woman who had survived her own share of hidden burdens that they were not simply dealing with an overbearing visitor. They were dealing with someone hiding from something, and that something was about to become everyone's problem whether they wanted it to be or not. If you've ever sensed that a person's strange behavior was covering for a pain they were not ready to name, you already understand the instinct that settled over Ifeoma. This is usually the point where a story like this either explodes into open conflict or quietly reveals its true shape. Ours is about to do both. Before we get there, if you're still with us, that means this story has already earned your attention. So go ahead and subscribe, because what's coming next changes everything you think you understand about Chinwe. Let's continue.
Ifeoma did not confront Chinwe that day. Instead, she did what she had always done best in 31 years of managing a household through crisis after crisis. She watched, quietly, patiently, gathering the small details that would eventually assemble themselves into a full picture. Over the following week, she noticed that Chinwe's phone, once a constant presence in her hand during the early weeks of her visit, had become something she seemed almost afraid of, glancing at incoming calls with a flinch before silencing them without answering. She noticed that Chinwe had stopped mentioning her husband entirely in conversation, where in the early weeks she had spoken of him often, small complaints about his snoring, fond memories of their courtship, the ordinary texture of a long marriage. Now there was only silence where her husband used to be, a silence so complete it had become its own kind of statement. She noticed too that Chinwe had begun asking Ngozi small, careful questions about whether there might be small work Chinwe could help with around the pharmacy Ngozi worked at, or whether Obina's construction firm ever needed someone to manage supplies or accounts. Questions dressed up as idle curiosity, but carrying underneath the unmistakable shape of a woman quietly searching for a way to support herself independently. A woman planning, perhaps, without even admitting it fully to herself yet, for a life that no longer included going home. Ngozi mentioned this to Ifeoma almost in passing during a Tuesday visit, describing a particular appointment where the pediatrician had asked, without looking up from her chart, "And has the baby been sleeping through the feedings the way her grandmother described?" A question that made Ngozi feel, in her own words, like a spectator at her own checkup. Ifeoma filed this away with the growing collection of small, unsettling details she had begun keeping almost without meaning to, the way a woman keeps track of a slow leak in her roof, unsure whether it warrants alarm or simply patient watching. The neighborhood, too, had begun to notice and comment in the particular way Enugu neighborhoods notice everything eventually. Mrs. Okeke, who lived 2 houses down from Ifeoma's compound and had known the family for over 20 years, stopped Ifeoma at the market one Saturday morning with the transparent curiosity of a woman who had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to ask, "Is it true your son's mother-in-law has moved in permanently? I saw her directing your gardener the other day as though she owns the compound." Ifeoma had deflected the question as gracefully as she could manage, though the encounter left her unsettled for the rest of the day, aware that whatever was happening in her household had become visible enough to outsiders that it could no longer be quietly managed or ignored much longer. There was too a Sunday evening when Ifeoma had walked past the guest room and heard Chinwe's voice through the half-closed door on a call with someone Ifeoma couldn't identify. Not her husband. The tone was wrong for that. Too careful, too deferential, almost the voice of a woman speaking to a landlord or a bank officer. "Just a little more time," Chinwe had been saying. "I am not ready to discuss the house yet. Please, just a little more time." Ifeoma moved on quickly, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, but the fragment stayed lodged in her mind for days afterwards. The house. What house? And why did Chinwe sound, in that moment, less like a doting grandmother extending a visit and more like a woman negotiating for time she desperately needed and didn't yet have a plan for? She raised the mystery once, carefully, with her own sister Ijeoma, not naming names, simply describing the pattern of behavior she had observed. Ijeoma, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived enough family drama to have theories about most things, offered her opinion without much hesitation. That kind of behavior, sister, the avoided calls, the silence about the husband, the sudden hunger for her own income, that is not a woman who simply loves her grandchild too much to go home. That is a woman running from something at home. I have seen it before. Watch her closely. She will tell you, eventually, whether she means to or not. Ifeoma decided finally that the time of patient watching had ended. Before she acted on that decision, though, she made one more stop, a quiet visit to Obina and Ngozi's flat on a weeknight when she knew Chinwe would be attending an evening prayer meeting in a nearby church, a rare few hours when the young couple had the flat entirely to themselves. She found them sitting together on the small sofa, not arguing exactly, but carrying the particular tension of 2 people who had been tiptoeing around the same unspoken subject for weeks. "I don't know how to say this without sounding ungrateful," Ngozi was saying, as Ifeoma let herself in, not realizing at first that she had interrupted anything. "But Obina, I feel like a guest in my own marriage some days. Your mother is one thing. She's always respected our space. My own mother has just quietly taken it over, And every time I try to say something, I lose my nerve because she looks so settled, so needed, that pointing it out feels cruel. Obina had looked up, startled to see his own mother standing in the doorway, but Ifeoma had simply taken a seat across from them, unwilling to pretend she hadn't heard. You are not being ungrateful, Ngozi. You are describing exactly what I have also been watching happen these past 2 months. I only came to see how the two of you were managing, and it seems the answer is not as well as either of you has been letting on to me or to each other. The three of them talked for nearly an hour that evening, longer and more honestly than any of them had talked about the situation before. Obina finally admitting how much he'd been avoiding the conversation out of fear of hurting Ngozi. Ngozi admitting how much guilt she carried at the idea of asking her own mother to leave. And Ifeoma, listening to both of them, feeling the last of her hesitation about intervening directly, dissolve into something closer to resolve. Whatever was driving Chinwe's extended stay, Ifeoma realized, it could no longer be allowed to quietly dictate the shape of her son's marriage. Something had to give, gently if possible, but firmly regardless. She invited Chinwe to her own house for tea, just the two of them, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, while Ngozi and Obina had taken Adora for her monthly checkup.
Chinwe arrived looking wary, as though she already sensed the true purpose of the invitation beneath its polite framing. They sat in Ifeoma's small room, the same room where Ifeoma had once entertained her own mother-in-law decades earlier, learning firsthand the particular tightrope every woman walks between two families joined by marriage. "Chinwe, my sister," Ifeoma began, pouring the tea herself. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I am asking as a fellow mother, not as an accuser. You have been with us almost 8 weeks now. Adaora is thriving. Ngozi is well cared for. I am grateful, truly, for everything you have done. But I notice you have not spoken of your husband in a long time. And I notice you do not answer his calls. I am not asking to shame you. I am asking because I think something is troubling you, and I think it has been troubling you since before you ever arrived here." Chinwe's hands trembled slightly around her teacup, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring down into the tea, as though the answer might be written somewhere in its surface. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all her earlier confidence, all the quiet authority she'd carried through 2 months of running Ifeoma's kitchen and Ngozi's household. It had become instead the voice of a much smaller, much more frightened woman. "My husband brought a second wife into our house 4 months ago, a woman younger than our own daughter. He did not discuss it with me. He did not warn me. I came home from the market one Tuesday and found her belongings already in the room next to ours, and he told me, as though he were mentioning the weather, that this was simply how things were now, that a man of his standing was entitled to more than one wife if he could provide for them, that I should learn to share my home with grace the way his own mother had shared hers." Ifeoma set down her own cup slowly, feeling the full weight of the story arriving all at once, the way a held breath finally releases. "Her name is Chiamaka," Chinwe continued, her voice hardening slightly around the name, though the hardness seemed aimed less at the young woman herself than at the humiliation her presence represented. 26 years old, younger than Ngozi. He met her through a business associate, he told me later, as though the details of the courtship were owed to me as some kind of consolation. I do not blame her entirely. She is young, and men like my husband know exactly how to make themselves appear generous to a woman who has nothing. But I blame him completely, and every day I stayed in that house after her arrival, I felt myself disappearing a little more, becoming a fixture in my own home rather than its mistress. He did not divorce me. He did not even discuss separating from me. He simply expected me to absorb her presence the way one absorbs a change in the weather, unpleasant but ultimately beyond anyone's control. "How long did you try to endure it before Ngozi's call came?" Ifeoma asked gently. 4 months. 4 months of setting 2 plates instead of 1 at dinner, of hearing her laughter through the walls some evenings, of watching my husband's friends treat the whole arrangement as though it was something to be quietly admired rather than something that had gutted me completely. When Ngozi called to say the baby had come, I told myself it was providence, an honorable reason to leave, a reason no one would question, a reason that let me run without anyone knowing I was running at all. I could not bear it, Chinwe continued, tears sliding freely now down a face that had for 2 months presented nothing but calm and competence to everyone around her. 34 years I gave that man, 3 children. I built that house alongside him with my own hands, my own trading money, my own sweat, and he brought a stranger into it without so much as a conversation, expecting me to simply absorb the humiliation and continue serving his meals as though nothing had changed. When Ngozi called to say the baby had come, I told myself it was providence, an honorable reason to leave, a reason no one would question, a reason that let me run without anyone knowing I was running at all. 2 weeks became easier to extend than I expected, because every week I extended it was another week I did not have to walk back into a house where I am no longer the only wife, no longer perhaps even the preferred one. I have been ashamed to tell my own daughter. I did not want her carrying my humiliation alongside her own new motherhood. I did not want you, Ifeoma, my daughter's mother-in-law, thinking less of me for a shame that was never mine to create in the first place. The room was silent for a long moment, the earlier tension between the 2 women dissolving into something far more complicated. Not resolved, not yet, but reshaped entirely, the way a disagreement about kitchen shelves becomes almost embarrassingly small next to the true weight a person has been quietly carrying. If you've ever discovered that someone's difficult behavior was actually the last visible edge of a much deeper wound, you understand exactly what shifted in that room. This is the twist nobody in that house saw coming, and it's about to change how every single one of them handles what happens next. We're heading into the hardest part of this story now. Stay close. Chinwe, Ifeoma said, finally, reaching across to take the other woman's hand. Why did you not simply tell us this from the beginning? No one in this family would have judged you for needing shelter from such a thing. We would have understood immediately. Because shame does not ask permission before it settles into a person. I have watched other women in my hometown endure this exact situation and carry themselves afterwards like something broken, something pitied. I did not want to become that woman in front of my own daughter, in front of her new mothers-in-law, in front of anyone. I thought if I simply stayed useful, if I ran the kitchen well, if I helped with the baby, if I made myself so necessary that no one questioned my staying, I could avoid ever having to say the actual words out loud. My husband brought another wife into our home. I have not even said that sentence to my own sisters yet. You are the first person I have told. Ifeoma sat with that confession for a long moment, feeling something shift permanently in how she understood the past 2 months. The rearranged kitchen, the overriding feeding schedule, the quiet assertion of control over a household that was not hers. None of it had been arrogance, she realized now. It had been a woman trying, in the only language she had left, to build herself a place to stand after the ground beneath her own marriage had been pulled away without warning.
She thought, too, of her own husband's death 4 years earlier, and the strange, disorienting months that had followed, when she too had thrown herself into a kind of relentless usefulness, reorganizing church committees, taking on more tailoring clients than she could comfortably manage, filling every waking hour so there would be no quiet space left in which grief could catch up with her. It had taken her almost a full year to admit to herself that busyness was not the same thing as healing, and that the frantic energy she'd poured into being needed everywhere had, in its own way, been its own kind of hiding. Recognizing that same pattern now in Chinwe, dressed in different clothes but built from the same instinct, softened something in Ifeoma that might otherwise have hardened into simple irritation at an overstaying guest. "You should have told us," Ifeoma said gently, "not because you owed us an explanation for staying, because carrying a wound like this alone, in silence, in someone else's house, pretending it doesn't exist, that is its own kind of punishment, and you did not deserve to punish yourself twice for a betrayal that was entirely your husband's doing." Chinwe wept properly then, the kind of weeping that comes when a person finally sets down a weight they've been carrying so long they'd forgotten how heavy it actually was. Ifeoma simply sat beside her, holding her hand, saying nothing further, because some moments do not need more words added to them. But understanding Chinwe's pain, Ifeoma knew, did not erase the real problem still sitting quietly beneath it. A household could not run indefinitely with two women silently competing for authority over it, however sympathetically reasoned. Ngozi still needed her own home back. Obinna still needed his mother-in-law's presence to shrink back down to something sustainable, rather than a permanent, unspoken second household layered invisibly over his own marriage. And Chinwe, however much compassion her situation deserved, still needed something more than an indefinite hiding place. She needed an actual plan for what her life would look like next, one that quietly cost her daughter's peace to sustain. "We will figure this out together," Ifeoma told her finally. "But it cannot continue exactly as it has been. Not because your pain doesn't matter, Chinwe, because it matters too much to let it keep expressing itself sideways through kitchen shelves and feeding schedules instead of being addressed directly." If you've ever had to hold both compassion and a boundary in the same conversation at the same time, you already know how difficult what came next actually was. Real resolutions are rarely as simple as someone packing a bag and leaving. This one required something far more delicate, a conversation involving every single person this situation had been quietly affecting. Let's get into it. The family conversation happened the following Sunday, arranged carefully by Ifeoma and agreed to, after some hesitation, by Chinwe herself. Obinna and Ngozi were there, Adaora sleeping peacefully in the corner of Ifeoma's sitting room, and for the first time in 2 months, every person whose life had been quietly reshaped by the past 8 weeks sat together in the same room, ready to actually say what needed saying. Ifeoma began, choosing her words with the particular care of a woman who had spent 30 decades learning that how a hard truth is delivered matters almost as much as the truth itself. "We are gathered here today not to shame anyone and not to ask Chinwe to simply pack her things and go as though the last 2 months meant nothing. We are here because every person in this room deserves honesty, and honesty has been missing from this house for too long, hidden behind politeness that was slowly turning into resentment none of us wanted to name." She turned to Ngozi fast. "My daughter, tell your mother what you told me in your kitchen that Sunday. Say it now, to her face, gently but fully." Ngozi's hands trembled slightly, but she looked at her mother directly. "Mommy, I love you. I am grateful for everything you've done for Adara and for me these past 2 months, but I don't feel like this is my home anymore. I don't feel like I get to decide how my own daughter is raised, or how my own kitchen runs, or even what my own husband and I eat for dinner. I have been afraid to say this because I didn't want to hurt you, and because some part of me sensed you are carrying something heavy that made living harder than it should be. But Mommy, I need my home back. I need to be the one raising my daughter, even if I make mistakes along the way. That is my right as her mother, and I have been giving it away piece by piece without meaning to." Ngozi paused, then continued, her voice gaining a steadiness that surprised even her. "I know. I have known for weeks, if I am honest with myself. I told myself I was helping. Some of it was helping, but somewhere along the line, helping became hiding, and hiding became taking up space that was never mine to take. I am sorry, my daughter. I did not mean to make you a stranger in your own home. I think if I look at it honestly, I needed to feel needed." The first month of the new arrangements tested everyone's patience in small, ordinary ways. Ngozi found herself second-guessing decisions she had once made instinctively, unused to the sudden quiet of a household without her mother's constant input, calling Chinwe sometimes 3 times a day for reassurance about things she had, in truth, already known how to handle. Chinwe, for her part, struggled with the strange emptiness of a life without a household to manage, spending her first 2 weeks in the boys' quarters restless and unmoored, uncertain what to do with hours that had, for 2 months, been entirely consumed by other people's needs. It was Ifeoma who noticed the drift first and gently intervened, inviting Chinwe to accompany her to her own tailoring shop one Tuesday morning, not to work, simply to sit and observe, to be around the rhythm of a woman running something entirely her own. Chinwe watched Ifeoma measure a client, cut fabric, negotiate a price with the easy confidence of 30 years' practice, and something in her seemed to wake up watching it. A hunger Ifeoma recognized because she had felt its opposite once herself, in the disorienting months after her husband's death, when she too had needed to relearn what it meant to build a day around her own decisions rather than someone else's household. But slowly, something steadier began to take shape. Chinwe visited Adaeze twice a week, joyful, welcomed visits rather than an unspoken occupation, and the two women, mother and daughter, found, to both their surprise, that their relationship actually deepened once it was no longer strained by unspoken resentment simmering under the surface of every shared meal. Ngozi, freed to make her own decisions about her daughter's care, grew more confident as a mother with each passing week, no longer second-guessing herself against her mother's quiet, constant corrections. She began, for the first time since Adare's birth, trusting her own instincts on the small daily judgment calls every new mother has to make: when to worry about a cough, when to simply wait it out, how to interpret her daughter's cries, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was better at it than she'd given herself credit for during the 2 months she'd spent constantly deferring to someone else's certainty. By the time Adaeze turned 1, Ngozi had become the kind of mother other new mothers in her circle called for advice, a role reversal she found almost dizzying given how uncertain she'd felt in those first difficult weeks. There was a particular afternoon, some 5 months after the boundaries had been set, when Ngozi called her mother, not of any crisis, but simply because Adaeze had said her first clear word, Mama, and Ngozi wanted her own mother to be the first to hear about it. Chinwe had cried on the phone, not the anguished weeping of her earlier months, but something lighter, more purely joyful, and had arrived at the flat within the hour bearing a small gift for the occasion, staying for dinner and leaving unprompted well before it grew too late, a boundary she now kept easily, almost naturally, the way habits do once the underlying need driving the old behavior has finally been addressed rather than simply managed around. Obina, watching the two women's relationship steadily mend itself over those months, found himself often thinking of his own father, gone 4 years now, and wondering what the old man would have made of the whole situation, the crisis, the quiet detective work his mother had undertaken, the eventual hard-won peace the family had built together. He suspected his father, a plain-spoken man who had little patience for unspoken grievances left to fester, would have approved most of all of the moment his mother finally sat everyone down and insisted on honesty over politeness. It was, Obina reflected, exactly the kind of lesson his father had tried to teach him throughout his own boyhood, one he was only now, as a husband and father himself, beginning to fully understand the weight of. Ifeoma, for her part, found herself an unexpected companion in Chinwe, 2 women closer in age and experience than either had initially realized, sharing meals in the main house some evenings, discussing everything from Chinwe's tentative plans for her small provisions business to the particular loneliness of a life reshaped suddenly by a husband's decision. Ifeoma helped her navigate the early accounting for the small shop she eventually opened 3 months later, a modest stall near the market, selling rice, beans, and provisions, built entirely with Chinwe's own hands and her own returning confidence. The shop's opening day, on a bright Saturday morning 3 months into the new arrangement, drew a small but warm crowd. Ngozi and Obina arrived early with Adaeze strapped to Ngozi's back. Ifeoma brought a tray of chin-chin she'd made herself for the occasion. And even Ijeoma, Ifeoma's sister, showed up with a gift of 2 new pots for the stall's back kitchen, declaring loudly to anyone within earshot that she had always known Chinwe had the makings of a fine businesswoman, a claim Chinwe found generously exaggerated but did not bother correcting.
standing behind her own counter for the first time in her adult life, weighing out beans for her first paying customer with hands that trembled slightly from nerves rather than grief. Chinwe told Ifeoma afterward that it was the first day in nearly 6 months that she had felt entirely like herself again, rather than a woman defined by what had been done to her. The conversation with Chinwe's husband happened 2 months after that Sunday gathering in Owerri, with Obinna present as promised, though he said little, simply standing beside his mother-in-law as she said, finally, out loud in her own home, in front of the man who had humiliated her, exactly what his decision had cost her, and exactly what she would require going forward. A formal legal separation, her fair share of what they had built together over 34 years, and an end to any pretense that she would simply absorb his choices without consequence. Her husband, caught off guard by a wife he had assumed would eventually return quietly to her old role, tried at first to negotiate, to soften his position, even to suggest that Chinwe might simply return home and learn to manage alongside Chiamaka as other women in the extended family had done before her. Chinwe listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, and then, calmly, declined it in full, stating plainly that she had spent 34 years managing a household that could apparently be reorganized around her without a single conversation, and she had no intention of spending whatever years remained to her managing a humiliation she had never agreed to share. It was not an easy conversation. There were raised voices, old grievances surfacing on both sides, a full accounting of 34 years of marriage compressed into a single difficult afternoon. But she walked out of that house, Obinna told his mother afterward, standing taller than he had ever seen her stand in the 2 months she lived in their home. The formal separation was finalized 4 months later, and though Chinwe caused a period of real financial uncertainty while the settlement was negotiated, Ifeoma and Ngozi's family stood behind her through every step of it. A solidarity Chinwe would later say meant more to her than the settlement itself. There was a difficult evening in month 5 when Chinwe's son, Ngozi's older brother, Kelechi, based in Port Harcourt, found out about the separation secondhand from a family friend and called Chinwe in anger, accusing her of destroying the family without consulting her own children first. Chinwe had called Ifeoma afterward, shaking, uncertain whether she'd made the right decision after all, wondering aloud whether she should have simply endured the humiliation quietly, the way, she said, women of my generation are supposed to. Ifeoma had driven over that same evening, sitting with her in the small boys' quarters until well past midnight, reminding her gently that a decision made for her own dignity did not require her children's permission to be valid, only their eventual understanding, which would come in time once the initial shock wore off. It did come eventually. Kelechi called back 2 weeks later, having spoken at length with Ngozi in the interim, and apologized for his earlier anger, admitting he had reacted from his own discomfort at imagining his parents' marriage as anything other than the stable institution he'd grown up believing it to be, rather than from any real judgment of his mother's choice. By the time of Adaura's naming anniversary, Kelechi had flown in himself to attend, standing beside his mother throughout the celebration with a new, careful tenderness that Chinwe said privately to Ifeoma felt like its own kind of healing. A year after Adaura's birth, the family gathered again, this time for the baby's naming anniversary, a full house, joyful and unstrained. Chinwe arrived not as a resident negotiating an unspoken permanence, but as a guest of honor, her own small business thriving enough that she'd brought gifts for everyone from her own earnings, a detail she mentioned with visible, well-earned pride. She sat beside Ifeoma for most of the celebration, the two women who had once quietly competed over kitchen shelves, now trading recipes and laughter with the easy comfort of people who had weathered something difficult together and come out the other side, if not unscarred, then at least honest. At one point during the celebration, Ijema leaned over to Ifeoma and murmured, only half joking, "The two of you have become thicker than some sisters I know." And Ifeoma, watching Chinwe laugh freely across the room at something Ngozi had said, found she could not disagree.
Watching her granddaughter take her first wobbling steps across the compound that afternoon, cheered on by both grandmothers at once, Ifeoma thought about how close that household had come to fracturing quietly, invisibly, under the weight of an unspoken truth nobody had been brave enough to name, and how much better, in the end, honesty had served every single person in that story than silence ever could have. Obinna, watching his wife laugh with her mother across the compound, both of them finally at ease in a way he hadn't seen since before Adara's birth, found himself thinking that the hardest conversations in a family are so often the ones that end up costing the least once someone is finally brave enough to start them. If this story taught you anything, let it be this. Boundaries and compassion are not opposites. They can live in the very same conversation, the very same room, the very same family. You are allowed to protect your own home while still holding space for someone else's pain. You are allowed to ask hard questions gently, and you are allowed to expect honest answers in return. Sometimes, the person who seems to be causing the most disruption in your life is simply the person most desperately in need of somewhere safe to fall apart. And recognizing that difference between someone taking advantage and someone quietly drowning can change everything about how a family chooses to respond. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know the kind of stories this channel is built on. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you need it most. And tell me in the comments, if you were Ngozi, how long would you have waited before having that conversation? I'll see you in the next one.